They called her a heretic, a witch, a liar. But what if the only thing she was guilty of was believing too much? She was just a girl, no army, no crown. And yet, she changed the fate of nations and terrified the most powerful men in Europe. This isn't the version they taught you in school. This is the truth they tried to bury, under fire, under silence, under time itself. Tonight, on Whisper from History, we don't just remember Joan of Arc. We relive her final days, moment by moment, until the flames took her voice, but not her legacy. Are you ready to hear what she heard? Then stay close and listen carefully.
The wind moaned low across the open fields, like a spirit searching for something lost long ago. Beneath the heavy sky of winter, the world was hushed, and time itself seemed to pause. Far from the thrones of kings and the cries of battle, there was a village too small to make it onto most maps. It lay nestled in the valleys of northeastern France, surrounded by hills that rolled like the backs of sleeping giants. They called it Domremy. There was no grandeur here, no stone walls or cathedrals, just earth and labor. Sheep moving like drifting clouds across the pasture, cottages with sagging roofs, and the smoke of hearth fires curling into the gray sky. Life in Domremy was the rhythm of soil and season, births, deaths, harvests, prayers, repeating like an old hymn. It was in this quiet that she was born, around the year 1412, though no one recorded the day. Her name was Johanna, but you know her as Joan. She was the daughter of Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romay, peasant stock, bound to land and labor like everyone else. They had 5 children. Joan was the youngest, small, pale, watchful. She learned to spin wool and carry water, to herd animals and knead bread. But even as a child, there was something other about her. Have you ever seen a person whose gaze seems to look beyond you, as if they're listening to something you can't hear? That was Joan. The villagers whispered it, that she prayed more than she played, that she spent hours in the chapel, unmoving, eyes closed, lips moving without sound. They said she cried while praying, that sometimes she seemed lit from within. Faith was not uncommon in those days. Everyone clung to it, because what else was there? The 100 Years' War had turned the country to ash. Plague had stolen entire generations. France was no longer a kingdom. It was a corpse being picked apart by vultures. And yet Joan believed. Not the kind of belief taught by frightened priests or painted in books no one could read. Her faith was something deeper, physical, visceral, like breath. She was no scholar. She could neither read nor write. Her world was fields and saints, mass and mud. But she believed in something more, that light could still burn in this black age. By the time she was 12, the voices began. At first she was terrified. The air around her would change, suddenly thick, charged, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Then warmth, radiance, and a sound, like bells far away, or music made of sunlight. She said it was the voice of St. Michael, the archangel. Others would follow, St. Catherine, St. Margaret. They came to her not as fire and thunder, but as light, voices without mouths, wisdom without age. They told her to be good, to go to church, to remain pure. But soon they asked more. They told her France was dying, that God had chosen her to save it, that she, a peasant girl from a forgotten village, would raise armies, drive out the English, and place the rightful king upon his throne. She was 13. Can you imagine it? Would you have believed? She didn't tell anyone at first. Who would believe a girl? In an age when women were considered little more than property, when peasants were crushed beneath taxes and war, when saints had long since fallen silent, why would heaven speak to her? But the voices kept coming, stronger, clearer, more urgent. Meanwhile, the world around her was unraveling. France was in chaos. The English, led by King Henry III, had carved a bloody path across the land. The crown was contested. A young dauphin, Charles, claimed it by blood, but had no coronation, no allies, and no strength. The Armagnacs and the Burgundians, French factions, were tearing each other apart. The Burgundians, traitors in the eyes of many, had aligned with the English. The city of Reims, where kings were crowned, was lost. Paris was held by the enemy. And the southern lands, where Charles still ruled, were slipping from his grasp. The tide was turning, and it was turning against France. Domremy, though far from the front lines, was not spared. English raids burned villages to the ground. Armagnac deserters, men who once fought for France, now pillaged their own. Churches were desecrated. Women were taken. Fields were salted. Joan watched all of it. Her home was spared for a time, protected by a local noble sympathetic to Charles. But even that protection was fleeting. One night, the bells of Domremy rang out in terror. Raiders came through, flames lighting the hills, screams piercing the darkness. Joan fled with her family, seeking refuge in the nearby town of Neufchâteau. She saw the devil's face that night. When they returned days later, the village was still smoldering. Homes were gutted, livestock gone. Everything that made life possible had been taken or destroyed. And still, the voices came. "You must go. You must lead. You must drive out the English and crown the king." They gave her no map, no sword, just a promise that she would succeed, because heaven had willed it. At 16, she made her decision. She would go to Charles, the Dauphin, the uncrowned king, and offer herself to him as the savior of France. But she was a peasant girl. She had no army, no wealth, no name. How does a girl from a village no one has heard of walk into the court of a prince? That's where the miracles begin. First, she convinced her cousin to take her to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs, where a local garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt, held sway. She told him plainly, "I must go to the king. God commands it." He laughed in her face, sent her home, twice. But Joan was unshakable. She returned again, and this time, something was different. She spoke with a fire he couldn't ignore. She predicted a French defeat near Orléans, one that later came true. She swore she would cross enemy territory unharmed. She told him things a girl should not have known. Robert, skeptical, hardened, and loyal to the king, relented. He gave her a horse, a sword, and an escort of men. They dressed her in male clothing, both to protect her and to disguise her from English patrols. She cut her hair short, fastened armor over a simple linen shift, and she rode, across winter roads, through snow and danger, past villages choked by war. A 16-year-old girl, riding toward a court she had never seen, to speak with a prince she had never met, to fulfill a destiny no one else could even fathom. Do you feel it? The weight of the moment? How silence once clung to her like shadow. And now the world itself seemed to hold its breath as she approached Chinon, the castle where Charles waited, hidden behind walls in despair. He would not recognize her. She would not be announced. But when she entered the great hall, something happened. The Dauphin stood among his courtiers, disguised, to test her. Joan walked past the richly dressed men, past the jewels and silks and whispers, and without hesitation she knelt before the true prince. "I am sent by God," she said, "and you are the rightful heir of France." Charles looked into her eyes, and history turned. Would you have believed her? Would you have knelt beside her? Or would you have laughed, as so many did? She had no title, no training, just a voice in the dark and a fire that refused to die. But soon the world would know her name, and the fires she would ignite would burn through empires. This was only the beginning.
They didn't trust her. How could they? A girl, unlettered, untrained, barely 16, claiming she was chosen by God to lead armies? France had heard many voices over the decades. Most were mad, others were liars, some worse. But this girl, this Joan, she was something else. The court of Chinon was no place for saints. It was a pit of smoke and whispers, thick with courtiers whose loyalties were for sale, where hope was just another mask worn at supper. They entertained her, yes. They were amused. A girl in armor, a girl with prophecy on her tongue. But beneath the silk and the smiles was doubt, cold, unyielding. So they tested her. Charles, indecisive, uncertain, ever shadowed by the question of his legitimacy, sent her to Poitiers to be examined by scholars and priests. Dozens of men, some of the greatest minds in France, gathered to break her, to prove that the voices were madness, that her visions were false. For weeks they questioned her, not with kindness, not with mercy, They demanded proof, theology, doctrine, signs. She gave them none. Instead, she answered with humility, with conviction. When asked why God would speak to her and not to kings or bishops, she replied, "He speaks to whomever he chooses." When asked for a sign, she said, "Send me to Orleans, that will be sign enough." And that was the miracle. She did not flinch. Not once. In every word she spoke as if heaven watched, as if the saints stood behind her unseen. There was no boast, no tremor, only fire. One of the scholars later confessed, "There is something in her of the divine." Still, it wasn't enough, so they tried something else. A virgin was more than just a girl in France. It was a vessel, holy, incorruptible, symbolic of the Blessed Mother herself. Joan had claimed to be a maid, untouched. If it were a lie, the church would tear her down. They examined her, physically, and what they found silenced many. She was pure. The last wall of doubt began to crack. Charles summoned her again, this time in private. Just the two of them, face to face. What she told him, only he ever knew. But when she left that chamber, the king's mask had changed. He had believed her, and now he would test that belief, not in whispers or parchment, but in war. Orléans, a city under siege, the last great bastion of French resistance on the Loire. The English had surrounded it with stone forts, iron will, and death. The city was starving. Morale was shattered. Surrender was a breath away. If Orléans fell, France would be broken beyond repair. That's where Joan would go. Not to counsel, not to pray, to lead. They gave her armor, white and gleaming like the light she claimed to hear. A standard, painted with lilies, and the names of Jesus and Mary. And a sword, one she never asked for. She said her true weapon lay buried behind the altar of the chapel of Sainte Catherine de Fierbois. They laughed, but when they dug where she told them, they found it. An old blade, rusted, ancient. 5 crosses etched on the hilt. It was cleaned, sharpened, given to her. She kissed it and rode out. Her journey to Orléans became legend. People came from villages, from ruins, from roads littered with bones, just to see her pass. They fell to their knees. They cried out her name. La Pucelle, the maid. She was more than hope now. She was myth, and myths move faster than armies. When she arrived at the gates of Orléans, the soldiers stared. They had heard of her, of course, the girl with voices. But what they saw unsettled them. She wore no helm. Her banner flew high, unstained. And behind her eyes, something ancient. They let her in, and the tide turned. The French commanders, old, blood-weary men, still resisted her. She was a child to them, a symbol, nothing more. They planned raids without her. They ignored her counsel. And then they watched her on the battlefield. She did not cower. She did not waver. She rode at the front, banner raised, shouting prayers and commands. Where her standard went, men followed. Where she fell, they lifted her. When she was wounded, a bolt through the shoulder, she refused to retreat. She pulled the arrow free herself and returned to the fight. Within days, the siege began to falter. English forts that had stood for months began to fall, one by one. Joan pushed the commanders to act, to strike fast, to trust not strategy, but faith. She told them which day to attack, which hour, even which gate. And each time, she was right. On May 7th, 1429, the French made their final assault. The last stronghold, the Bastille of Les Tourelles, held firm as the sun rose. Arrows fell like rain. Fire roared from towers. Joan led the charge, climbing a ladder as iron clanged all around her. Then a cry. She was struck. An arrow pierced her chest. The French faltered. The line began to break. But Joan, bleeding, rose again. Her banner lifted once more. She shouted to the men, not in fear, but in fury. "Do not flee, the victory is ours." The French surged. By nightfall, Les Tourelles was burning. The English commander lay dead. The siege was broken. Orléans had been saved, She had done it. A girl, a peasant, a voice. And yet, you must understand, it wasn't just the city that had been liberated. It was France itself. For the first time in a generation, people began to believe again, not just in a crown or a country, but in something greater, divine. And Joan, barely 17, stood at the center of it all. But victories come with shadows, and in the courts of men, miracles are dangerous. Even now, they were watching her. The nobles, the priests, the kings, waiting. Because if heaven could lift her up, then surely earth could drag her down, and the war was far from over.
There is a moment, just after the storm, when the sky breaks open and light returns. Birds sing again, smoke lifts, and for a brief breath, the world forgets the pain that came before. That moment came to France after Orléans. Word of the maid spread like fire through the kingdoms. No longer was she a curiosity, she was salvation. Soldiers wept at her presence. Mothers named their daughters after her. Chroniclers, once silent, began to write in the margins of history, wondering if a prophet had risen. But in castles and courts, the question was whispered. Was it truly God who walked with her? Or something else entirely? Joan did not rest. She said her mission was not complete. She had delivered Orléans. Now she would deliver the king. Charles VII, Dauphin of France, uncrowned and uncertain, had lingered too long in the shadows. To wear the crown was to claim legitimacy. To claim legitimacy was to unite the fractured soul of a bleeding nation. But Reims, the sacred city of coronation, lay deep in enemy territory. To reach it would mean marching straight through English-held lands, fortified towns, and battle-scarred fields. Every noble around Charles advised against it. But Joan did not hesitate. She told him simply, "God has cleared the path, now walk it." And so he did. What followed was not a march, it was a pilgrimage. From Gien to Auxerre, from Troyes to Chalon, towns surrendered without a fight. Gates opened, bells rang, crowds poured into the streets weeping and singing as the maid passed by. Soldiers threw down their weapons. Priests bowed in silence, not because of Charles, because of her. They believed in her more than any prince or treaty. She carried no sword in these moments, only her banner, white and holy, as if it alone could part the darkness. Then, on the morning of July 16, 1429, the gates of Reims opened. Charles entered the cathedral the next day. He walked beneath vaulted ceilings as golden light poured through the stained glass, casting fire across the stone floor. And there, in the heart of the ancient church, the Dauphin was anointed with holy oil, oil preserved from kings past as old as France itself. He became Charles VII, King of France, and Joan stood beside him, banner in hand. When asked later why she carried her banner rather than a sword, she replied, "It had borne the burden. It was only right." She had fulfilled her vision. The voices had promised a crown, and she had delivered it. But the air changed after Reims. The king was crowned, the war was not won. Joan thought they would march on Paris next, the jewel of France, held by the Burgundians and their English allies. She was ready. Her blood burned for it. But Charles hesitated. He began to negotiate, to send letters, to listen to cautious men in velvet robes who had never seen the fires of siege. Joan begged him to act. Strike now, while the people still believe, while God still walks with us. He delayed, and the delays began to rot everything they had gained. Paris was not defenseless, but it was unprepared. Joan pushed him, pleaded, and finally, he allowed it. In September, they approached the city. It was not like Orléans. The people of Paris did not weep at her presence. There were no open gates, no songs. This city was wary, hardened, loyal not to her king, but to the Duke of Burgundy, a man who wore French blood on his hands. Joan attacked. She charged the walls herself. Her banner high, arrows fell like rain. She pressed through, trying to scale the embankments. Her men followed, hesitantly. Then, silence. A bolt struck her thigh. She collapsed, screaming. They dragged her back under cover, her blood soaking the earth, her voice hoarse with rage. She begged to return, begged to die if that was the price. But the king's advisors, already eager to end the assault, called the retreat. Paris remained in enemy hands, and for the first time, Joan had failed. It was subtle at first, the way people looked at her, no longer as a saint, now as a symbol, one that could be manipulated or discarded. The king grew distant, the nobles whispered, the clergy began to wonder if perhaps her voices were no longer divine. Still, she fought on. Through the winter, she led minor skirmishes, defended towns, pushed back raiders. But her victories were quieter now, less important. The crown she had restored to Charles no longer seemed to protect her. By the spring of 1430, she had been denied access to court. No summons, no commands, just silence. So she acted alone. A town called Compiègne had come under siege. Burgundian forces surrounded it, allies of the English, as cruel and cunning as any invader. Joan could not bear it. She gathered a small force and rode to defend it, with no official sanction. It was her last battle. On May 23, 1430, during a sally from the gates of Compiègne, she was cut off. Her men were driven back. The gates closed behind her too soon. She turned to face the oncoming cavalry, banner in hand. But it was over. She was pulled from her horse, taken prisoner by the Burgundians, and no one came for her. No rescue, no army, no message from the king whose crown she had delivered. She was sold. For 10,000 livres, they handed her over to the English. The girl who had turned the tide of war was now a prize. Not of gold, not of blood, but of fear, because if Joan had truly been sent by God, then her victories were divine, her cause righteous, and that made her enemies damned. They couldn't let that stand, so they would break her, not with blade or fire. Not yet, but with the slow torture of bureaucracy, heresy trials, and silence. They would unmake her, word by word, because what threatens power more than a peasant girl who listens to God, and who still, even in chains, refuses to be afraid?
Rouen. The city reeked of damp stone and secrets, a place wrapped in fog where voices echoed too long and justice came slowly, if at all. Here, behind thick walls and iron bars, they kept her. Joan. No longer the Maid of Orleans, no longer the banner-bearer of a king. Now she was just a prisoner. 19 years old, wrapped in coarse wool, chained by the ankles to the floor of a cold cell. They gave her no comfort, no priest, no solace, only questions, and a verdict already decided. The English could not execute a holy woman, a saint, but a heretic, a witch. That they could burn. And so they brought her to trial. Not a court of justice, but a theater of fear. A tribunal of men cloaked in God's name but twisted by politics. At the center was Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, a man more loyal to England than to truth. It was his ambition, his signature, that would seal her fate. The trial began in January of 1431, and it was never meant to be fair. Joan stood alone before them. No advocate, no defense counsel, no preparation. She faced a panel of learned theologians and canon lawyers, armed only with her faith and the voices that had guided her since she was 13. They asked her everything about the visions, the voices, the angels, what they looked like, what they said, whether they wore jewels, whether they kissed her cheeks, whether they were truly from God or something darker. She answered with calm. With clarity, when asked if she knew she was in God's grace, a trick question, designed to condemn her no matter what she said, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God so keep me." It stunned them. This girl, this uneducated farmer's daughter, had just outmaneuvered their trap. But they kept coming, day after day, hours of interrogation, sometimes in public, sometimes in secret. They wore her down. She grew pale, thin, sick. Still, she resisted. When they asked if Saint Michael had wings, she answered, Do you think God cannot give him wings if he chooses? They called her stubborn, proud, insolent, but she would not lie. They tried to trick her into admitting blasphemy, into saying she worshipped her banner, or that the saints had misled her. She refused. They accused her of dressing like a man, of wearing male clothing during her campaigns, in prison, even now. She said simply, "It is the clothing that protects me. The voices told me to wear it." To them, it was proof of perversion. To her, it was armor. And still, the verdict never changed, because it was never about guilt. It was about erasure. If Joan was right, if heaven had spoken to a peasant girl, if her visions were real, then God had bypassed the church, the English, the bishops, the universities, the kings, and that was unforgivable. By May, the trial neared its end. The judges drafted a list of her supposed crimes: sorcery, heresy, idolatry, cross-dressing. The sentence was inevitable: death by fire. But the church needed more than a verdict. They needed her to confess, to submit, to deny the very voices that had shaped her life. And they offered her a way out: public recantation in exchange for a lesser punishment. It was cruel mercy. In the cemetery of St. Ouen, before a crowd hungry for spectacle, they led her to a scaffold. Her enemies surrounded her. English soldiers jeered. Monks whispered final prayers. The firewood had already been piled, and Joan broke, exhausted, starved, humiliated. She signed the abjuration. Barely legible. A single trembling hand. They took her back to her cell. She wept. Days passed. She wore the dress they gave her, ate the food they offered, said little, but the voices returned. They told her she had betrayed them. They told her the truth had not changed, and something inside her reignited. She threw off the dress, took up the male clothing again, said she would rather die than deny what God had given her. She told them, "I spoke the truth. My voices have not deceived me." The English were furious. The church, humiliated. She had recanted her recantation. That was enough. On May 29th, the judges declared her a relapsed heretic. No more trials, no more mercy, only fire. And so, on the morning of May 30th, 1431, they let her out. She wore a long gown, white, simple. Her feet were bare, her hands bound. The square in Rouen was already crowded. Thousands pressed against the barriers. Some came to mock, others to mourn, some just to witness the end of a legend. The pyre stood in the center, tall, cruel, final. They read the charges again. She asked for a cross. A soldier fashioned one from 2 sticks and handed it to her. She clutched it tightly to her chest. Then she asked for another, a proper crucifix, to be held before her as she died. A sympathetic Englishman brought it from the nearby church. She looked at it as the flames rose. She did not scream for long. Her last words were not curses, not pleas. They were prayers. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. The smoke swallowed her, and when it cleared, there was nothing left but ash and silence. The executioner wept, and the crowd, even the English, left in haunted quiet. What they had burned was not just a girl. It was hope. Fire had devoured a body, but not the memory and not the truth. They had meant to silence her forever. Instead, they made her immortal.
20 years. That's how long it took for the silence to speak again. 2 decades of shadows, of muttered regret and uneasy glances, of a king who owed his crown to a girl he had abandoned to fire. The same king who said nothing as she burned, now sat secure on a throne she had carved with her blood. But ghosts do not rest, not when justice is undone. In 1450, Charles VII, older now, wearied by rule and haunted by memory, opened an investigation. He claimed it was for the record, for the crown, for the church. But those who listened closely knew better. This was an exorcism. The first inquiry began quietly. Witnesses were summoned, testimonies collected, priests, soldiers, townspeople. Anyone who had known her, seen her, stood in her shadow. They spoke of the girl from Domremy, how she had knelt in the fields as a child, whispering to angels, how she had saved Orléans, how she had never once claimed glory, only purpose, how she had believed when no one else dared to. They wept when they remembered her. Some refused to speak, ashamed of what they had done or not done. But still, the truth bled through. The second, more formal trial began in 1455, ordered by Pope Calixtus III. It was called the nullification trial, its purpose to determine whether Joan's conviction had been just. But it was more than that. It was a resurrection. By now the winds had shifted. France had begun to reclaim itself. The English were fading, and Joan's name, once a curse in English halls, had become a hymn in the French countryside. The tribunal convened in Rouen, the same city where she had been condemned, where ash still lingered in the cracks of old stone. A dark symmetry. The lead judge was Jean Bréhal, Inquisitor General of France. Unlike Cauchon, he had no thirst for English favor. He sought something different: truth. Over the next year they heard from over 100 witnesses. Some had been at Orléans. Some had seen her trial. Some had spoken with her in her final days. Their accounts converged into a single, aching shape. They described her courage, her chastity, her wit, her faith, how she had never blasphemed, never lied, how she had loved God with a fury that terrified even the devout. The court uncovered records, falsified documents, irregular procedures, illegal imprisonment. They learned how the English had paid Cauchon, how the trial had violated canon law at nearly every turn, how her confession had been coerced, how her execution had been preordained. And piece by piece, the lies collapsed. On July 7, 1456, 25 years after she had been tied to the stake, the court announced its ruling. Joan of Arc was innocent, a martyr, a victim of political hatred, false accusation, and broken faith. Her sentence was annulled, her name restored, but no voice came from the grave. No hand reached back through time. Her body was gone, her bones scattered in the river long ago. She would not walk again among the fields of Domremy. She would not touch the altar in Reims. The ruling could not bring her back, but it could remind the world that she had lived, not as a heretic, but as a heroine, not as a threat, but as a sign. And yet, even then, it was not the end, because the world forgets and remembers again. Centuries passed. Wars rose and fell. Kingdoms crumbled. The church changed. The language changed. Her story faded into legend, and legend into symbol. But she endured. In 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte, emperor, conqueror, cynic, declared Joan a national hero of France. Not for her visions, but for her fire, her defiance, her proof that destiny could come from a peasant's heart. The church watched and waited, and finally, in 1909, she was beatified. In 1920, nearly 500 years after the smoke had lifted above Rouen, Joan of Arc was canonized a saint by Pope Benedict XIII. She was no longer heretic, no longer warrior, no longer just woman. She was Saint Joan, her feast day set, her statues raised, her name immortal. But perhaps the greatest proof of her power is not what came after. It's what she left behind. An idea that God could choose anyone. That courage lives in the quiet, that conviction does not ask permission, and that even when betrayed, even when silenced, even when burned, truth still walks through fire. And walks out again, because what was Joan of Arc if not fire in human form? And what is fire, if not something that refuses to be forgotten?
The wind over Domremy has not changed. It still moves through the fields the way it did 600 years ago, brushing over wheat and river stone, whispering through the poplars where a girl once knelt in prayer. The village is small, almost forgettable. But if you walk slowly, if you listen, something lingers in the stillness. It's the echo of a life that never belonged to just one girl. Joan of Arc died in Rouen, but she never truly returned to the soil, because her story did not end with sainthood. It twisted, grew, fractured, claimed by kings, by revolutionaries, by generals, by zealots. Everyone wanted a piece of her fire. France, especially, could not let her go. In the centuries after her death, her image shifted like smoke: martyr, miracle, myth, warrior, witch, woman. During the Enlightenment, philosophers scoffed at her visions, but admired her resolve. Revolutionaries in 1789 invoked her as a symbol of the people, a peasant who had stood up to monarchy and church alike. The irony didn't bother them. They wore her image on their banners, even as they guillotined priests and kings. During the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, French nationalists resurrected her once again, this time not as a saint, but as a soldier of France. They spoke her name with clenched fists, their boots pressed into trenches, their eyes turned east, toward the enemy. She became an emblem of resistance, of purity, of divine favor. And so, a new war began over her memory. Not with swords, but with sermons, politics, ink. The church, having canonized her, clung to her sainthood. They elevated her above the battlefield, painting her in soft gold light, haloed, untouchable. The military wanted something different. They stripped away the saints and left behind the steel. Joan, the commander. Joan, the tactician. Joan, who had shamed cowards and led men twice her size into fire without blinking. And then there were others, groups that would twist her further. Far-right nationalists in the 20th century painted her as the ultimate patriot, a warrior of racial purity, a shield against outsiders. They ignored the truth of her life, that she had fought not for hate, but for unity, not for vengeance, but for conviction. She had never once spoken of bloodlines, borders, or supremacy, only of duty, only of faith. And yet, the myth marched on. During World War I, her image appeared on postcards sent to the front. French soldiers carried medallions with her likeness. Some said prayers to her before battle. Generals evoked her in speeches, calling her the soul of France. In 1940, as Nazi boots thundered down French streets, the question returned: whose side would Joan have stood on now? Vichy collaborators claimed her. So did the Resistance. Both wrapped themselves in her legend. But the truth, she belonged to neither. Because the Joan who lived, the one who bled in the mud outside Orléans, who screamed in the dust outside Compiègne, who whispered Jesus as flames swallowed her, could not be tamed by politics. She had spoken not for power, but for justice, not for glory, but for God. And in that truth, there was danger. Even today, no one truly agrees on what she was. Some say schizophrenic, others divine. Some say manipulated, a puppet of schemers who saw a use for her visions. Some say visionary, a girl who saw the truth too clearly, too early, and paid the price for it. But what is certain is what she did. She changed the course of a war. She gave a broken nation its crown back. She stood before generals, priests, kings, and did not flinch. And she did it not because she wanted to be remembered, but because she believed she was doing what was right. Ask yourself, how many people ever truly live that way? How many burn and do not retreat? Her story is taught in textbooks now, watered down, stripped of blood and fire. But the real Joan, the one they tried to erase, still lives in the silence between the lines. You can hear her in the hush before battle, in the cries of the betrayed, in the soft voices of children who pray for strength without knowing why. She rises not in glory, but in grit, not in crowns, but in conviction. And perhaps that is the truest miracle. Not that a girl heard voices, but that she listened to them, and then acted.
There are moments in history when the world seems to hold its breath, moments that do not announce themselves with trumpet or banner, but with a single decision made in silence. For Joan of Arc, one of those moments came not with swords raised in battle, but in the quiet hush of Rheims Cathedral. It was July 17th, 1429. The morning sun poured through stained glass like blood and gold. The air was thick with incense and the breath of men too proud to kneel but too afraid to speak. And at the center of it all stood the Dauphin, Charles, uncertain, indecisive, a prince weighed down by the shadow of his own doubt. And beside him, her, Joan, not clad in armor this time, but in a dress, plain, stained with dust and sweat from the road, her hair cropped short, her eyes hollow from the months of war and the miles she had ridden to bring this man to this very place. She had made a promise that she would see him crowned, and now she had delivered him to the altar. But even here in the sacred heart of France he hesitated. Joan knelt before him, not as a subject, not as a servant, but as a force greater than any title. She looked into his eyes and whispered, "Gentle Dauphin, now is the time. You are the true heir. Do not turn away from what heaven has ordained." The bishop began the rite, and the crown was placed on Charles's head. The choir rose. The crowd wept. And Joan, overcome, collapsed to her knees, her banner in her hands, her face streaked with tears. "Now," she said, "is the will of God fulfilled." But fulfillment is rarely simple or final. The coronation was a miracle, but it was not peace. France was still fractured. The English still held Paris. The Burgundians still prowled from the north. The people still starved. And Joan was tired. She was not the girl from Domremy anymore, not the fresh-faced shepherdess sent by angels. She had been baptized now, not with holy water, but with blood. She had seen her men fall in the mud of Jargeau, felt the bite of arrows outside Troy. She had watched as cities crumbled under cannon fire and fields turned to ash. But worse than any wound was what came next. The turning. After Rheims, something shifted. Charles began to pull away. His trust wavered. His counsel, the cautious whispering men who hated the sway Joan held, began to poison his ear. She was dangerous, they said. Too bold, too popular, too divine. She was a reminder of what he had not done on his own. So when Joan begged him to push toward Paris, to strike now when morale was high, when the people were rising, he stalled, delayed, negotiated. Joan went anyway. She rallied what men she could, marched north, reached the gates of Paris, and launched the assault herself. And for the first time, she failed. She took an arrow to the leg. Her banner fell. Her forces retreated. And still she would not give in. She recovered, marched again. But the tide had turned. No longer backed by royal gold, her campaigns became harder, riskier, the soldiers fewer, the supplies scarcer. Towns she had freed began to fall again. And then came May 1430. Compiègne. The town was under siege. Joan rode to its defense, a final desperate charge. And in the chaos of battle, as she tried to rally her men through the city gate, she was pulled from her horse. The gate slammed shut behind her. Trapped, surrounded, she fought, screamed, demanded to be ransomed. But it wasn't the English who took her. It was the Burgundians, and they knew what she was worth. They held her for months, negotiating the price of her head. And Charles, the king she had crowned, the man whose throne she had bled for, offered nothing. Not a coin, not a word, not a hand. She waited in chains. She waited in vain. And at last the English paid, 10,000 livres, for a girl who had once turned the tide of history. And they took her to Rouen. You know what happened there. But what you must understand is that the betrayal began long before the fire, not in the courtroom, but in the silence of kings, the silence of allies, the silence of heaven itself. And still, she never turned bitter, never cursed Charles, never renounced her mission. She was human. Yes, she feared the fire. She wept in the night. She questioned, but she never broke. She had marched from Domremy to Reims not for glory, not for power, but because she believed she had been called, and even when left alone, abandoned, condemned, she held fast to that call. That is what made her dangerous. Not the sword, not the visions, but the fact that she listened to something greater than fear, enacted, when no one else would.
In Rouen, winter crept in like a sickness. The walls sweated with damp, the sky hung low and gray, and the wind bit with a spite that seemed almost personal. The city had become a fortress of dread, not because of its battlements, but because of what it now held. Joan. She was moved from cell to cell, guarded not by simple men-at-arms but by English captains, sworn to keep her chained, watched, silenced. Day and night, 3 guards stood vigil in her stone prison. She was denied a confessor, denied mass, denied rest. Her legs shackled, her body bruised, but it was not her body they wanted to break. It was her soul. The trial, if you could call it that, began in February of 1431. It was a spectacle draped in robes and titles. Bishop Pierre Cochon presided, a Frenchman loyal not to France but to the English cause. He had not earned his bishopric. He had been promised it, if he delivered the maid. He intended to do just that. She was dragged before a tribunal of doctors, clerics, and inquisitors, 70 in all. Learned men, most older than her father, faces carved from pride and scorn. She stood alone. 19 years old, no lawyer, no advisor, no advocate, just the memory of her voices and her will. They asked her hundreds of questions about her visions, about her clothes, about her mission, about angels, saints, and sin. Each question a trap, each word twisted, recorded, dissected. But Joan did not falter. She answered with clarity, with precision. When asked whether she believed she was in God's grace, a question designed to ensnare her either way, she paused, then said, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may He keep me there. I should be the saddest creature in the world if I knew I were not in His grace." The court fell silent. That answer, simple, defiant, profound, would echo for centuries. They pressed harder. They mocked her visions, called her hallucinations the tricks of the devil. They demanded she renounce her belief that St. Michael had spoken to her. They scorned her for wearing men's clothes in battle, as if cloth could damn a soul. She refused to renounce what she had seen. She refused to lie to spare herself. But every defiance came at a cost. Her food was fouled, her sleep shattered. They threatened torture. And when that failed, they turned to something worse. False mercy. In late May, after months of interrogation and humiliation, she was led to the cemetery at Saint-Ouen. There they staged a mock execution, a platform built, a fire lit. They told her she would burn unless she signed a confession. Her strength was nearly spent. Her eyes, once burning with holy fire, were sunken. She broke, for a moment. In fear, in exhaustion, she signed a document, its contents twisted and false. She recanted, promised obedience to the church, promised silence, and for a brief, terrible moment, they celebrated. But then, she took it back. Days later, she stood in her cell, once again wearing the man's clothing they had taken from her, and declared that what she had signed had been under duress, that her voices had returned, that they had forgiven her, that she would not deny them again. The English exploded in fury. To them, she was no longer a heretic to be tamed. She was a relapsed heretic, and for that, the penalty was death. They moved swiftly. No more questioning. No more deceit. Just flame. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, the sky over Rouen was veiled in smoke. She was led to the Vieux Marché, the old marketplace, where the scaffold had already been built. The executioner hesitated. The crowd, some loyal to France, some indifferent, gathered in grim silence. She was tied to the stake. They gave her a wooden cross to hold. A priest raised it before her as the flames licked the air. She cried out for Jesus, for her saints, for the church she still loved. As the fire rose, she screamed his name again and again. A girl of 19, condemned by men twice her age, dying not for ambition, not for crime, but for faith. Eyewitnesses wept. Even the executioner broke, later swearing he had great fear for his soul. And when it was over, there was no body left to bury, only ashes and a heart. Unburned. The executioner, terrified, swept the remains into the Seine, to scatter what might have been holy, to erase what they could not defeat. But it was too late. They had made her a martyr. They had made her eternal. Because in trying to silence her, they had let the world hear her more clearly. In trying to destroy her, they had made her legend burn even brighter. The stake could not hold her, nor the fire. Not really. Because truth, when it is lived without compromise, becomes something fire cannot touch. And Joan of Arc, poor girl, warrior, prisoner, saint, had lived the truth so fiercely, it set the world alight.
The fire had gone cold. The smoke long vanished. And yet the name lingered. Joan, La Pucelle, the maid. For years after her execution, Rouen bore the weight of what had happened. The marketplace where she died grew quiet. Merchants whispered. Priests crossed themselves when passing by the place where she had cried out, Jesus, with her last breath. But for those who had stood and watched her burn, something else began to settle. A sickness, a doubt, a slow, corroding shame. Because lies do not die as cleanly as people do, and the truth has its own way of rising. In 1456, 25 years after her death, King Charles VII, the man she had crowned, the man who had done nothing to save her, ordered an inquiry. Some say it was guilt. Some say it was political. But whatever the reason, the wheel of justice turned once more. What followed was unprecedented. Testimony was gathered from across France. Over 100 witnesses, soldiers, townsfolk, priests, nobility, all brought forward to speak of her life, her actions, her trial. And one by one, they did. They remembered her courage. They remembered her purity. They remembered the girl who rode through cannon smoke with her banner high, who slept among the soldiers but never once was dishonored, who wept at the wounded, who prayed more than she ate. Even her enemies, when pressed, could not deny it. The trial, they found, had been a sham. An execution dressed up as theology, a murder signed in ink and sealed with fire. And so, in a solemn ceremony, Joan of Arc was posthumously declared innocent, not just not guilty, but holy. She was lifted from the ashes, her name restored. But by then, the woman who had changed a nation was long gone, and her country, the one she had bled for, the one she had believed in, was changing again. France had won the war. The English, defeated, retreated across the sea. The dream that Joan had died for, a united France, led by a French king, free from foreign hands, had finally come true. But it came without her, and in her absence, her memory began to grow, uncontrollably. Centuries passed. Her face appeared on paintings, statues, cathedral walls. Her armor, recreated in silver and gold. Her banner, once torn and bloodied, now held aloft in processions and parades. She became the patron saint of soldiers, of France, of the misunderstood. And then, in 1920, nearly 5 centuries after her death, the Church made it official. Joan of Arc was canonized. Saint Joan, from peasant girl to warrior, from prisoner to martyr, from heretic to saint. But ask yourself, what changed? The girl who heard voices and spoke with fire, was she any different in 1920 than she had been in 1431? Or had the world simply caught up to what she had always been? We love to worship the dead once they are safely gone. But Joan had never asked to be worshipped. Only believed, only followed. She had not fought to be canonized. She had fought to do what was right, no matter the cost, and it cost her everything. But perhaps that is why we remember her. Because in a world of politics, compromise, and fear, there was once a girl who lived without any of them. a girl who chose conviction over comfort. A girl who died with nothing, no family beside her, no friends to mourn, no body to bury, and still held to her truth as the flames climbed higher. Her story is not one of victory, not really. It's a story of defiance, of purity in a world built to crush it, of a voice, unshaken, crying out across time. And maybe that's why, centuries later, we still say her name. Because Joan did not ask for history to remember her. She asked for France to remember who it was. She asked for us to listen when the voice calls, even if it speaks softly, even if it speaks only once, even if it speaks through fire.
Time forgets most things. Names fade, stones crumble, victories dissolve into dust. Even the sharpest swords rust eventually. But not Joan. Not the girl who came from nowhere. Not the girl who listened to voices no one else could hear. Not the girl who changed the fate of a kingdom, with nothing but faith. Because some stories are not just remembered, they are relived. Every time a young woman stands against an empire, every time someone chooses what is right over what is safe, every time conviction outlives fear, Joan walks again. Her story has outlived kings, outlived wars, outlived the very church that once burned her. It has been twisted, romanticized, politicized. She has been made into a symbol, a weapon, a saint, a brand. But if you strip all that away, the armor, the crown, the fire, you are left with something simpler, something harder. A teenage girl, alone, frightened, and utterly, unimaginably brave. She was not fearless. That's a lie we tell ourselves to make heroes feel distant. She was afraid, trembling, human, but she walked into the fire anyway. That is what makes her story terrifying. That is what makes it holy. Because Joan of Arc was never meant to be possible. History doesn't make space for peasant girls. It crowns men. It records wars won by generals, not visions. It remembers speeches, not whispers. But still, she came. Still, she spoke. And in speaking, she cracked the armor of the world. Her life lasted only 19 years. Less than 2 decades. A blink in the span of time. But in that blink, she shook kingdoms. She crowned a king. She turned back an army. She defied a church. She became immortal. And yet, she never wrote a book, never ruled a country, never built a monument, never asked to be followed. She only believed in God, believed in France, believed in her voices, her calling, her cause. And belief, real, raw, defiant belief, is one of the most dangerous forces this world has ever known. That is Joan's true legacy, not the battles, not the canonization, but the permission her story gives the rest of us. Permission to listen to something deep and quiet inside ourselves. Permission to act, even when no one else will. Permission to stand alone, and still stand. Because the question Joan leaves behind isn't just who was she. It's what would you have done if you heard the voice? Would you have stepped forward? Would you have left your home? Would you have ridden into war with nothing but a name and a dream? Would you have stood trial for the truth? Would you have faced the flame? Or would you, like most, have remained silent? That silence is why she still matters. Because Joan of Arc did what most never will. And through her courage, she reminds us that every generation has its own fire, its own war, its own voice calling out in the dark. The only question is, will we listen? Will you? Because sometimes, history doesn't need another king. Sometimes, it needs a girl with a banner, and a heart that cannot burn.